And there it goes. So tonight we have Karen Lopez with us, and she's going to be presenting migrating data and databases to Microsoft Azure. So this talk is going to focus on that, and you probably hear because you read the abstract, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. I think it says a lot in the title. But Karen is awesome. Karen is a data evangelist for Info Advisors, right? A space enthusiast and NASA Datanaut, which I'd never heard of until I really read Karen's bio, and I'm pretty sure I've seen this in some other speaking engagements you've done. So, you know, Karen has a lot of experience, 20 plus years of public speaking. I've seen her speak, I either at user groups or past, and she's always a delight to listen to, and just a very knowledgeable and experienced speaker. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Karen.
Okay, great. Just before I share my slides, because I know it's going to change my screen all over the place. So I will be talking a little bit about the NASA Datanaut program at the end. I'm going to try to save 2 minutes for that because it's a non-commercial commercial, and I'll talk about that. I want to thank you for having me. I've done a lot of virtual presentations over the last 18 months or so, but this is sort of, you know, the Azure Data Platform groups or the Azure Tech groups are, you know, people did a lot of them and I didn't, and now I'm getting back into doing this. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. So let me share my screen.
And we appreciate you being here for us.
Thank you. And yeah, I'm based in Toronto. So it's been a long day today, but not that that bugs me at all. I'm usually a night owl. This says that this presentation is intermediate. It just means I'm going to assume that you have basic understanding of IT concepts, Azure, and SQL Server or Azure DB terminology. Having said that, one of the things I noticed, I didn't see access to chat in the Teams meeting. Can other people see it? And by the way, I can't see it now because I'm presenting. But if you have a question, feel free to come off mute and interrupt me. I actually enjoy that. I don't consider it rude at all. And I'm Canadian, sort of, so I will just be very polite about it anyway. So
thanks for bringing that up. I don't have the ability to change the options, unfortunately. So it looks like, yeah, unfortunately, everybody, like she said, unmute and ask a question that way. You can also use the raise your hand button.
Yeah, and I think I don't get to see the raise your hand things, so if you could help me monitor for that as well. While I'm sharing my screen, I can't see much at all.
Absolutely.
And not just because I'm getting old. So so during this little introductory part, I'm going to leave my camera on. I guess you guys can still see it, but in a couple of slides, I'm going to turn it off because you don't need to see me scowling while I try to reel in a window or something like that. So as the introduction said, I've been doing this for 20 plus years, but the deep dark secret is I've been doing it for more than 30 years. I've just been told that putting anything more than 20 on your slide makes you too old to present. So I say 20 plus with a smile and a wink. I am a frequent speaker on data modeling and data-driven methodologies, but I'm also a Microsoft MVP. I have a lot of experience with SQL Server, but not as a DBA, not as a developer, not as business analytics. My general role, besides data evangelist, or in this snarky photo of me as a digital smarty skirt, is that I really consider myself a data architect, which means that I normally design databases based on business requirements, security requirements, and cost, benefit, and risk trade-offs. That means that I bring a different point of view than a lot of presenters on Azure or SQL or databases or data platform. It means my presentations are going to be more focused on the opportunities that you have. It's a brief introduction to the tools that are available and some of the trade-offs. So my mantra as an architect is every decision comes down to cost, benefit, and risk. And that means that, you know, that it depends answer, the universal consultant issue, applies almost every time, but not just because I'm a consultant, but because I'm an architect. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer. I've done some exam prep training for DP200 and DP201, which are the, I think, older or about to be deprecated exams for Azure Data Engineer Associate certification. And I'm working on training materials for the single replacement exam for those as well. I'm also an MVP in data platform and a NASA Datanaut. So why do I talk about this topic then? Well, I spend a lot of my time on paid projects talking with customers about how to do migrations. And there are so many bad stories out there. I don't know, well, I'm certain that none of you attending have ever been associated with a project that just went wild and got crazy and took longer and went way over budget. I'm sure none of you did. I certainly have heard these stories at my brother's half-aunt step-sister-in-law's beauty salon's cat groomer about migration stories that have gone bad. The other thing is that I consider all upgrades a migration, and I know this is a contentious thing, but I think every upgrade project should be treated exactly the same way as a migration project, because not just because that some upgrades require you to also move to new hardware or facilities or regions, but because the cost, benefit, and risks with upgrades are very similar to moving or to transferring to another platform. The same costs, risks, and benefits. It just might mean an upgrade has more things similar from the source to the target. There's so many gotchas here. There are so many new tools. In fact, when I opened up this presentation, and I should note that this presentation is actually based on a full day pre-con or workshop that I do with hands-on labs and those sort of things, and lot more demos. But because we're squishing this all into 1 hour, I'm going to stick to this as a way of inspiring you and giving you some resources that you could go out and explore on your own. And there's so many techniques to do these. And in fact, there's a couple more I had to add to the deck just at this time. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera. So I have a poll that if we had chat, I'd have you respond to. So this is typical. I ask people who you are. Are you a developer, a DBA, a project manager? You know, and so that I get a better feel for which of you, you know, how I should target the things. So I'm going to have to make an assumption here that you guys are all, you all support production SQL Server-like systems in the world. And if that's not true about you, you know, thank you for staying along. But for this sort of thing, I have to decide where I'm going to focus my time. And again, I'm not a DBA, I'm not a developer, but I am going to talk about the tools, the theories, and the cost, benefit, and risks. So the other thing I usually ask people is, have you ever hands-on participated in a production migration? I'm going to assume everyone here has, and that if we were in the full day workshop, we'd talk about people's experiences. And then the next question, because my presentations are all full of snark, of have you ever participated in a successful migration project? And that just means I know that there are a lot of stories out there that migrations that actually ended up working, but they took longer. There were lots more trial and error and a lot more, we'll call it refactoring along the way. So the roles and responsibilities on migration projects are often misunderstood at the beginning. So for instance, data professionals, which is the term I use, which is interesting because that's the name of this user group, is I tend to use the term data professional to be inclusive of people who work with data technology. So DBAs, data analysts, data architects, BI folks, database devs, the server team, the storage guys. And I put that in quotes because almost everyone always says the storage guys, even if there are women involved. And then the snarkiness. So, oh, the other thing I forgot to mention, when I do this full day workshop, I often do it in collaboration with Tom LaRock, who is also a data platform MVP. And he likes to put in these little snarky things, making fun of architects, to say that all our job is to sit around and criticize people and have a beer. which totally isn't true. We like whiskey instead. So when most people think about migrating to Azure, they think about a concept that's more about lift and shift, which means I want to take my SQL Server database and the web server and the networking configuration. I just want to get it into Azure and have as many, to refuse as many changes as possible. Just get it in there and we'll work on it later to get it optimized for Azure. And as we've learned over the last 10 years or so, lift and shift often isn't the right choice. So while the cloud is really just someone else's data center, it's still not the same. Performance expectations can be really difficult to deal with because of either these differences, or the one that people forget about is just plain old physics, that if your cloud data center is 3 times further away than your crosstown data center, that's going to have a physical impact on performance, but there are ways of dealing with those things. So because of that, one of the things that people forget to do when they're migrating to the cloud is to create baseline measurements of performance. Because I'm pretty sure all of you have been through this. No matter what you do, no matter how much hardware you throw at a new system, no matter how much better and optimized code and upgraded code you do, there will be some users out there who are just insistent that the new system is much slower. If you have baselined all the performance of your current workloads wherever you're starting, you now have data to bring back to them to say, nope, it's not slower, or yeah, it's slower by 25%. We need to fix this. If you don't have those baselines before you do your migration during the whole variety and life cycle of your workloads, like even a year before, going back a year, you're just going to have to say, oh, we don't think it's slower, and that doesn't work. The other thing about going to the cloud is a lot of people think about security, and they think of security, remember I talk about cost, benefit, and risk, they think of it as extra risky and less secure. And I'm kind of doubtful on that because I don't know about you guys, maybe because I have that, because I'm old and experienced and have that 30 years of experience. But I used to have to support a lot of systems that were located on servers, heaven forbid, underneath someone's desk or in a closet, basically a closet rack that was sitting there, especially for development technologies. So one of the things about going to the cloud is you can take advantage of many more of the security environments. That's not just encryption, not just key vaults, but things like better monitoring and cheaper monitoring, and integrated monitoring and alerting and all of those things. Plus, sometimes shifting data and a workload to the cloud and not taking advantage of new services that are already there and already fitting within your new cloud strategy might be a much better thing. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those, but that's definitely something that we can't cover in an hour. So one of the reasons, so because I'm used to be a SQL Server MVP and now I'm Data Platform One, was the big question of when you take SQL Server to the cloud, why would you choose Azure SQL DB? So Azure SQL DB is the, Microsoft doesn't use this term, but the database as a service for SQL Server. And there were a lot of people that didn't want to do that early on. First of all, the first instances of Azure SQL DB, through the 8 names it had over the last few years, was it had a lot of limitations, like a lot of really serious ones. Now that SQL Server on-prem and Azure SQL DB have a heavily shared code base, and there are fewer and fewer limitations or conflicting features going from SQL Server on-prem to Azure SQL DB, we talk about why should you do this? And it's the typical cloud story that scalability is much easier to scale using all the different options for SQL Server. They have things called elastic pools, which is basically you get to throw a whole bunch of resources at a whole bunch of databases, and they can share those, and they can each be blippy in workloads, and they don't hit the same cats that they would if they each had their own dedicated resources for it. There's also better monitoring and alerting. There are uptime service level agreements. There can be better disaster recovery. And in some people's minds, I know this is contentious, I think my data is more secure in an Azure environment than it is in a poorly secured on-prem environment, even though it's hooked to the internet. So some of the costs, benefit, and risks of any cloud solution is the first one that people always talk about is vendor lock-in. And that can be true depending on where you're going. And if that's a real issue for you, your cloud solution could be SQL Server running in a VM that you manage. And therefore, you're running basically the same thing as SQL Server on-prem, just in a cloud VM. If it's less of a concern, you can go with one of the other options for migrating SQL Server to the cloud or any other database into SQL Server on the cloud. Some of the benefits is that, definitely cloud thing of much more elastic scalability than people typically have on-prem. Sometimes better high availability and disaster recovery. There's the monetary things of operational expenses and capital expenses. Depending on where you go into the cloud, it's do you need ACID, which is traditional relational database approach to data consistency, or could you use base, which is, basically available, mostly consistent, like what do you need when you go to the cloud? Some cloud offerings have tunability of consistency. There might be different durabilities. You might want to just use a service. I'm working with a client now that their entire IT strategy is they will purchase everything as a service before they'll purchase as something they have to manage. So they'd much rather choose Azure SQL DB or Cosmos DB or one of those offerings than to pay for infrastructure and then have to manage everything inside that infrastructure. So when this upgrade workflow, this is basically my project management methodology, no matter what's happening. But I believe that all projects start with discovering everything, what skills you have, what tools you have, where you want to be, do assessments of how well they're working, then plan for your migration, then implement it, then review and test it, then monitor it over time, and you just keep going through this cycle. And this is a very common cycle. This slide appears on a lot of my projects because I think that all projects work this way. So having talked about sort of really high level stuff today, and one of the things I tell people is giving a presentation about Azure is really hard to do because in the past, in the olden days, if I wanted to do a presentation about SQL Server, I downloaded a copy of SQL Server and that copy didn't change unless I intentionally changed it. But with all cloud technologies, not only do I have to check what's changed, including brand names too, what's changed since I started, what's changed recently, what's in preview versus what's in general availability. And then I have to do that a week before the presentation. And then I have to do it the day of the presentation just to make sure that I'm not using horribly obsolete screenshots or examples or saying that. Having said all that, because I'm reusing slides that I've used before, it could be that some of the example source and target options that I'm listing on the slides have been updated. That's very common with data platform tools that they initially support some technologies and then they move on to others and they get added. So consider anything on these slides as a suggestion and not as the definitive thing, because again, everyone working in the cloud has to go figure out what the current information is. And by the way, I think that's a plus, having had to work in a lot of data centers where things just never got upgraded until they absolutely had to. So I like that upgraded features and offerings are just available to me because they became available in the cloud. So some high-level tool options that are available to us if we're just talking about Azure, by the way. So Azure Migrate is a collection of tools, some of even the other tools in these other squares and services that is intended to be a much larger set of services that manages migration, not just for databases, but for servers, for storage, for basically anything that you might have on-prem or in the cloud that you might want to move or upgrade or transition to another service or tool. It includes things like discovering all the databases and all these other resources. Of course, it does much more than just databases. It has all these tools for estimating costs and sizes and growth and all these things. And it would permit you to do lift and shift at scale. And what I mean of it at scale is you could, if it made sense, point it to all your SQL Server databases, plan it all out, do all the discover, assessment, mitigation, and then just have it go through everything and migrate it at very large scale. Now, having said that, that seems odd to me as an architect to mass migrate huge numbers of things. The only time I've done that in my career, just because of the complexity of migrating, is when we were doing something where we wanted to replicate production resources into a new Azure environment for developers to start playing with and learning on. But that wasn't a production migration, really. So the ones in yellow are the ones that are going to be the focus of what I'm talking about tonight. So there's Data Migration Assistant. This is an app that you can download that does a couple of assessments before you migrate of compatibility and features from your source to your target. And sometimes it offers up ways of fixing those things. Sometimes it just has to tell you, this feature does not exist in the cloud, and therefore you need to fix it in your source database, or you won't get it in your target database. You have those two options. But sometimes it just means, changing a data type on a column from text to variable character or something like that. It can be used for even SQL Server upgrade migrations. So like going from 2016 to 2019, it can help you do that assessment and migrations. And it can move schema and data. Then there's SQL Server Migration Assistant. This is, how do I want to say, an experience tool that's in SQL Server Management Studio that allows you to do things like, oh my gosh, migrate from Microsoft Access or MySQL or Oracle or SAP to SQL Server or Azure SQL DB. So we're not going to talk much about that. I do have a couple of slides on it, but that's kind of out of scope of this presentation. Then there's, just to be confusing, something called Azure Database Migration Service. So DMS is also designed to do like batch upgrades or migrations of a lot of databases. So it scales much more than just Data Migration Assistant, which is one database at a time. And it's typically used on larger databases, very large databases, or many of them at one time. And then there's something called Data Experimentation Assistant, which is used really only for upgrades. And it has also existed for a while, and we're not really going to talk about that today. But I wanted to make sure, and of course, other than these options, there are do it your own way, like build your own migration using scripts and some SQL Server integration services, or third-party tools that do this, or other cloud providers that do this, because I'm sure all these things exist on the AWS side to get you out of Azure and into AWS. Like, there's many more options for this, but when I list them here, it means these are sort of the SQL Server Azure options for these things. So even within these, there are some migration options, and this is just a tiny subset. But you could see that using method 1, you could take your source DB, if it were on-prem SQL Server, this is the old way we used to do it, and you export a backpack. And a backpack, this is something you do in SQL Server Management Studio. It basically takes your schema and your data and sticks it in a file that kind of looks like a backpack. And then you would then import that backpack into another SQL Server database or Azure SQL. And that was how we did it. Now, some of the interesting things is, in order for that to work, the source and the target databases and servers needed to be very compatible and very similar. And even then, like if you were upgrading, there were things that you had to do in order to make that work, but this is how we did it. And one of the interesting things about a backpack file is it's really a zipped file. So if you ever want to see what's inside a backpack, you could rename it you say it right, ZIP, and then open it in your favorite archive or unzipper tool. Another method you could do it is using Data Migration Assistant. Remember, that's the app that you download to do these things. And you use the app, point it to your source DB, then it generates T-SQL in order to deploy to your target database, which could be SQL Server or Azure DB and all the flavors of Azure DB. So this is also compatible databases. The difference between just the method 1 and method 2 is Data Migration Assistant will tell you where most of the gotchas are that you can't migrate to your target database, or it's a deprecated feature, or it's not supported in your target. So it can do that. And method 3 is the same thing, but doing all of this via a Visual Studio Database project or an Azure Data Studio project. And this is just the start of methods. These are the basic ones. So some other things you'd want to do, because I talked about discover was the first step. Like, what do you have? What is in this database? You know, how is it configured? So there are things like the MAP toolkit, which is available, which is MAP stands for Microsoft Assessment and Planning. That basically does similar things. It tells you what your database that your source is, you know, what are all the things in it. Then there are third-party things like SQL PowerDoc. There's probably PowerShell scripts and DBA tools and all that. I, in the past, have always used data modeling tools to do these migrations because I'm a data modeler. So these are tools I have. So I would reverse engineer my source database. I would forward design it, not forward engineer, but forward design it for the target database, then generate the SQL out of that and deploy it. There are change management tools that can do this. There are configuration databases. There are just so many tools that you could use to prepare for this or actually do the actual work of changing your databases for the required things or enhancement things to get to your target. So this slide is probably out of date, but SQL Server Migration Assistant. Now, this isn't data management, so all these tools have the same name. This isn't Data Management Assistant. There are tools within SQL Server. There are tools that have been around for a long time that supported migrating from like Access, MongoDB, SQL Server, Oracle DB2 to get you to the other things. But as you can see from this screenshot, This tool is very experienced, and I probably wouldn't choose this tool right now unless it supported a source database that these new and modern tools don't support. So those are the sources, and that might be incomplete, but the destinations are SQL Server, Azure SQL DB, Postgres on Azure, all those flavors, and Cosmos DB. So if your source or your target is not supported by the other tools we're talking about, I would point you here to get started. Then there's Data Migration Assistant, which, like I said, is a really simple app. And I'm gonna demo that in a bit, but it checks for, depending on your source database, it checks for feature parity, like are there features you're using in your source database that you can't use in your target? And then there's, like in the screenshot on the right, there's compatibility issues. So for instance, the feature parity here is that the target database doesn't support this feature of this one feature of Azure Key Vault integration. And the compatibility issue is that full text search for whatever version of my Galactic Works has changed since SQL Server 2008, and you might have to deal with it. And the great things about using these assessment tools is they often have links or mini scripts to help you mitigate this issue before you migrate. Then I also said there's data migration services, and that's an Azure service that does a lot more things than Data Migration Assistant, but it includes Data Migration Assistant. So you have these on-prem or other cloud infrastructure as a service sources. So in the example in the top left, the source can be a SQL Server database. And then my target over on the right could be Azure SQL managed instances or SQL Server on an Azure VM. Then on number 3, you could actually, one of your sources could be not the SQL Server database on-prem, but an actual native backup file and the log backups from SQL Server. And then that uses number 6 below it, self-integration runtime. And the self-hosted integration runtime is typically a feature of something called Azure Data Factory, which is a data integration tool. But because this is using a backup file to move into Azure, it makes use of the self-hosted integration runtimes if your backup file is on-prem. And then you can also do all of this under that with number 4, which is Azure SQL Migration Extension in Azure Data Studio. And I hope you didn't pick Azure in this evening's drinking game, because I'm saying it a lot. Basically, you have these types of sources. So SQL Server on-prem, a backup of them, or using a tool of Azure's Data Studio. On the right-hand side, let's see, we covered number 2 with the target. Number 5 is the actual data migration service, and it is associated with the self-hosted integration runtime, but it orchestrates. Remember, data migration services is targeted at very large databases or a whole bunch of databases, and it orchestrates all of this migration. The other thing is, instead of migrating a backup from your on-prem, you could upload those backups into an Azure storage account and then use that for your migration. And one of the reasons why people migrate from a backup typically is because they don't want to have servers on-prem with an internet connection. So they can't do it live against the database, but they can do a backup and then restore through migration services to the target services. Whew. That's a lot. So some limitations on data migration services. It's only available for certain regions, so not all Azure regions. I said it leveraged the integration runtime for Azure Data Factory, but it can't use the same integration runtime as you use for Data Factory. So you can have more than one, but it can't use the same one. Right now, one of the big limitations is you can't use data migration services to overwrite an existing database. So while that does sound problematic with a migration anyway, just know that attempting to do that will mess everything up. And that right now, migrating multiple databases that are on the same target server can also mess everything up. So this sounds like those last two sound like limitations that they may fix, but for right now, they're a known issue, I should say. So even when you use data migration services, the objects that will not get migrated are logins, SQL agent jobs, credentials, SSIS packages, server roles, and server audit. So all that means is you need to find a way to migrate those things as well. Okay, so before I start the demos, and while I get some windows done, please someone have a question or even a comment about any of these things.
Is there any benefit to any of the various methods of getting things over to Azure as far as performance goes, if you say have a very large database?
I actually have a slide about that later. So yes, of course. And this is another reason why people migrate from a backup instead of connecting to an on-prem server or a server on another cloud service. So can I answer that one later? And then
yeah, that's fine.
Simple answer. Okay, so what do I want to show first? Let's go with this one. Gosh, I don't want to get rid of this one screen, so I will share this. And so I'm going to show you this out of order only because it takes a very long time to generate this screen. So, and one of the things about Data Migration Assistant is it's new and it's very, it's modern and it's new and it's very fast at what it does because it has a very limited feature set, but it also it doesn't persist things. So if I hit back, I'm going to lose all this screen. So having said that, let me set you up. I'll show you this later, but I'll set you up for what I'm showing you. So I selected a vendor database, meaning it supports developers, and it just happened to be a database on my laptop. So I ran Data Migration Assistance against this database on my laptop. Now, having said that, my source is this vendor database, and the target is an Azure SQL database in the cloud. And so to be fair to this vendor, it was not designed for that. It could have been deployed as a database on a VM, but it's not. And this database isn't designed for it. And you can see all these warnings. So for instance, there is a stored procedure, but you might have to fix it because it uses old style joins, which by the way, you shouldn't be doing those in any SQL Server instance. And there's no suggested fix. It basically says you need to go figure this out and fix it, or that stored procedure won't be migrated. Like it just won't be migrated at all, or it'll get migrated and it probably won't work because the old style joins are not supported in Azure. So that's one particular thing it found doing this assessment. Same thing on this one. Old style join seems to be really common, but I know there are some down here. Come on, now I won't be able to find them. I found some that had, see how one development approach totally messed up this migration. So here we go. A fix opportunity. This one says it uses the old join syntax, but it can look at it and give you a suggested fix and then you could apply that to your source database, or wait, you could apply it in the script that gets generated. So you're basically replacing that. Let's see, are they all going to be this old style join? Oh, look at all this. Yeah. Basically, I should tell this vendor that they're using old style joins, and that's bad. So this is a totally unfair thing to do to this vendor by assessing it to see how well it could be migrated to that, but that's what makes for a good demo. So if I go back, I'm going to go back one more. So this is, oh, I want to be up here at assessment. So Data Migration Assistant does two things. It assesses and it migrates. And these are the two different tabs on the side. So I have an existing assessment, but I could go do another one. So and the assessment type, right now, I'm just going to use, I'm not going to use integration runtime. I'm using the engine, which means I'm talking to SQL Server directly. I could be migrating from SQL Server, which means SQL Server Box, or an AWS RDS for SQL Server. And my targets could be Azure SQL DB as a managed instance, or on managed instance, or on a virtual machine, or to another SQL Server instance. So this is just creating the assessment. And then I can choose to check database compatibility, feature parity, or both. And in some cases, depending on your source and your target, you can also, a data migration assistant might also recommend changes. So the typical recommended changes are things like, hey, we found this column. It's called credit card. Its name is credit card in your database. And you might consider either applying data masking to that column, which might not have been available if you were migrating from an older SQL Server instance, or it might recommend encrypting it. Like, it's going to recommend new features that are available in your target system that weren't available in your source system. Oh, now it's going to log in. It's going to look at my source. I'm going to choose the database. This time it's GalacticWorks, which for me is just a special version of AdventureWorks that I put some space things in. And it's going off, oh, I'm going to say start the assessment. And it's going to go off and do the assessment. So this works really quickly because that database is very small if you're familiar with AdventureWorks. So this is where I got the screenshot. It's saying that there are unsupported features in the target that I have in my source that aren't supported in the target, and I need to do something with it. So I can't use Azure Key Vault integration with TDE and SQL Server. So I need to do something with it. And that's the only thing it found for feature parity and for compatibility issues. It also measures for SQL Server based on compatibility level. And for this database, there's only two depending on my, so this is the full text feature has changed. I need to know that. And also I have a data type in my source database that is deprecated. Now, one of the secrets of deprecation these days is almost nothing in SQL Server that has been announced as deprecated has ever been removed, not in recent history. And that's because vendors now hate making changes that break compatibility. So, but in my case, I'd want to engineer out a deprecated feature if I had a chance to migrate. So I would probably change this from text or image or in text or whatever it is to something that was compatible. And then I could choose to upload this assessment to Azure Migrate. Remember, that's a bigger migration thing if I were using it. But I could also choose to do a migration. So I did an assessment before, and now I want to say I'm going to migrate using data management, data migration assistant. So I have pointed it to my Azure SQL database, and I'm just going to hit next. This takes a little bit. Did anyone have any questions so far about Data Migration Assistant? Okay, good. That went fast. So this tells me all the things that it found that it's ready to migrate. And you can see I'm still getting the same warnings that I had before of these incompatibilities, but now I'm in migrate form. So I go ahead and generate this script. Hopefully that didn't take long. And it's not important that you read the script, but that you can see that this is doing all the normal things of everything that you would see in generated DDL for all kinds of things. And this is the entire script ready to be deployed to Azure. And it's very large. I always love it when DBAs tell me they don't trust tools, so they're going to handwrite all the scripts. And I can't imagine handwriting all of these scripts. And this is also where I could go to each issue and it will mark it up and either offer suggestions or tell me what I have to do right in the script itself. So I could go find those. I could save this script, use another tool like my script authoring tools to do any of those things. So I don't know what's going to happen if I try to deploy it without. So this is now running against my target database, which was empty. It has to be empty. And you can see some red dots went through. So errors happened because I didn't remedy any of these situations. And it's just going away. So like I said, in the old days, I had to do all these assessments by hand. I had to hand fix things in my target database data model. And then I had to work with my DBA to make changes to the scripts. And that took a lot more time than what I've been able to demo right here. Any questions at all about watching T-SQL go by or watching execution statuses go by? Okay, so while that's running, oh, did somebody have something? Let me stop that, share a different screen. This out of the way. So this is Azure Data Studio, which is not yet a replacement or not a replacement for SQL Server Management Studio, but it's another set of tools that a lot of people use for managing SQL Server because it's a modern development tool. It supports notebooks, like if you've ever used Jupyter-like notebooks or Azure notebooks. It's just a more modern development environment, but it looks kind of the same. I have these connections, I have databases, I can open Galactic Works, it has tables, it does all these things, but I can choose Manage here. And I can do a SQL assessment, which is something totally not related to migrations, but I would do it as part of the Discover part of this project. But I can run Azure SQL a migration, and I can choose my account, my tenant. I can choose the database I want to migrate. So this is again pointing to the one on my laptop. And it's going to do a very similar assessment because it's leveraging all these other tools. It's just right inside of my database management tool. So in this case, my target can't be Azure SQL DB. It is just, I can only migrate to Azure SQL Managed Instance or SQL Server on a virtual machine, which I don't have set up right now. And so I could choose this for now just to get it, even though there isn't one. Oh yeah, so I don't have one set up, so I can't continue with this, but this is just to show you there's another way to run those technologies. So let me get out of that. and then share. I need to go back to the other screen. And now you can see all of that script ran. I normally wouldn't go next because I had errors in this deployment, but I could also choose to migrate the data. And let's see. So one of the things I talked about, one of the things about going to the cloud is you can scale. So sometimes when people are doing migration or loads, they scale up their target databases so that their resources on it to handle this big constant workload to make migrations go faster. So I'm just going to say that I don't know what's going to happen because I had errors. I can start the data migration. And off it goes to start migrating all the data from my laptop up into the Azure database that it just created. Isn't that magic? No? And of course, you have to have certain rights on your sources and your targets to have this all work correctly. And as that's completing, so I find this ease of use much better than all these homegrown hand-rolled scripts, because often all of those things don't do assessments. You just do a lot of trial and error with them. It's almost done. Or is it done? Yep, it's complete. So I have just in these few clicks, which all demos are intentionally simple, I have managed to assess my source database, migrate it into Azure SQL DB, and get all the data there as well, probably all of it, but I let it go with errors. One more thing I want to show. Let me find it. Oh. So this, I'm not sharing, let me share. This is SQL Server Management Studio, sort of the traditional all features everywhere version of managing SQL Server. I have that same database. There's all kinds of things that I could do here, like data discovery and classification, which is a tool that appears in other places in Azure, but also here locally on my laptop. And you can see this is the type of classification that I mentioned that Data Migration Assistant might be able to do. But this is built right into SSMS, is that it will go through, look at the names of columns, not the content. It also supports many languages, and it can make a guess about the information type and the sensitivity label just based on the name of a table. I did not create this. My co-presenter did. He was trying to test it in Spanish, but he doesn't know Spanish. So he made up a name, Tarjeta Credito, for credit card, and it recognized it as a credit card and confidential, even though that Spanish really doesn't make any sense either. And it can do this. And if you accept all these classifications or add them, you can actually now save the classifications into your database so that it carries forward any place tools that support the classifications can read, like self-serve BI or other data related tools on the platform. So this type of assessment that I would do would help me understand the sensitivity of the data before I moved it into the cloud. Maybe I need to keep it out of certain regions or only in certain regions. This is good to know. I'd say if you have good naming standards, this hits about 80% of your data in a good way, so it saves a lot of time. The other task here, there's vulnerability assessments that you can do before you migrate. Sorry. And where was the, there are the database upgrade things. So if your migration strategy is to do an upgrade locally and then move it versus move it and upgrade in your target, these are some of the tools available to you in SSMS. But there's a whole lot more stuff here that could be used to help in migration. I'm just touching on it. Yes, I went to cancel, sorry. So let's get back to the slides real quick. I wish I could have demoed more and made it more complete, but this is good. Okay, so pre-upgrade thinking, know what your path and decisions be, and especially of your entire team, because most people have completely different ideas how a migration or an upgrade is going to go. There are licensing issues. You need to have an inventory first to under it. You need to understand deprecated features, ones that have been actually discontinued, what your breaking changes are going to be, how the behavior of your workloads might change, or the behavior of your app might change. Release notes are good too. Always take baselines before you migrate. I cannot emphasize how much you're going to come back and thank me if you do that, especially your workload statistics. And you want to take many backups along the way in case something failed, like you forgot to remedy one of the things. It's good to document your task, but that's my inner project manager talking. The new feature recommendations are good if you can get them. The trade-offs between tuning and scaling, that's one of the biggest differences between SQL Server on-prem or any database on-prem and anything in Azure. So scale doesn't replace tuning, but there are a lot of things that you can't do, say in Azure SQL DB, not because it's an arbitrary limitation, but because these are services and you can't do things that you could do on-prem because it's a database as a service, with the expectation is that you scale up or scale out rather than constantly fiddling with the knobs in your database engine. So the simple version of migration is much like my demo. Target, do the assessment, run the little report, make the changes, and then migrate your database. But in reality, and it's even more complex than what's here, is you should identify what new features you want to use. You may be required to use them, like encryption. Identify all the stuff in your system that you really don't need anymore. For instance, SQL Server agent jobs don't exist in Azure SQL DB because there are other ways of automating jobs against your database. Same thing goes for file layouts and all of those things and the number of files you have. You want to do those compatibility issues things and make those changes and then migrate your database. So I will be providing these slides after this, so I'll go through these quickly. There are some examples of how not to use any tools and just DIY it, do it all on your own. And I'm lazy and I don't want to do all this, especially because the tools I'm talking about, they don't cost anything. So the answer to your question, what about bigger data? So there's something called Azure Box. It's no longer in preview. Sorry, I didn't update that slide. This allows you to take a big chunk of data for Azure Data Box. That's targeted at 40 terabytes of data or more. But since then, they've added to this because now there's Azure Data Box Disk, which is basically an SSD that they send to you. You put your data on it and you send it back. And then there's Azure Data Box Heavy that is for very, very large amounts of data. So this comes down to physics, is it's often faster and cheaper. Like the Azure Data Box Disk costs about $100 US, and there's a whole bunch of it depends here, that you can put your data on it, ship it back to Azure, and get your data loaded into storage much faster. And this is all due to physics. There are also some ways of optimizing data movement. There's an import-export service. This may have been taken away, but they did used to offer the ability to just send your hard drives to them. AZ Copy is a tool that's free that optimizes parallel uploading of data and restarting it if it fails. And then you could just throw a whole bunch of scale at it and wait a long time because of physics. So one of the things, there's usually more on this, but I just wanted to point out that you have to worry about security and privacy here, because as data is moving around, people forget to secure it as much as they do in production. So encrypting, all kinds of things like your backpack files before you move them around, your backups as well, all of that stuff. Then there's some tips here. This is from Tom. Take your backups, make sure you do all the commands you need to do because you've redone a database. You should, do some brute force testing, which is, did all the rows make it? You should check the configurations and enable or deploy new features. I'm going to go through these things. So I think you should take advantage of new things. You have all these tools that are basically free to use, and they do a fairly good job. They're not going to catch 100% of the things. Oh, and there's no thank you slide. So the one last thing, and I know I'm over by a couple minutes, but please bear with me here. This is my non-commercial commercial. The NASA Space Apps Challenge, which is the world's largest global hackathon. It's 100% virtual this year. I am a mentor in the program because I'm a NASA Datanaut. I'm also going to be helping with the judging. This is a hackathon where not everything has to be application or code. The only thing the challenge is required is that you use open data from NASA or one of the 9 participating space agencies that are also participating in that, including my favorite one, the Canadian Space Agency. And there are even art challenges. So these are really fun to do if you have kids or you just don't feel like coding. There are, and it's all virtual. It takes place over 3 days. I love judging this and mentoring. There are hundreds of city locations that are doing it. Like traditionally, these are on-site all weekend things, but like I said, this is all virtual. And I just wanted to promote, look, there's one on ontologies, which has nothing to do with coding really. And a lot of them are environmental challenges as well. So that's all I had. I'm Karen Lopez. I'm based in Toronto. My company name is Info Advisors. I'm Data Chick on Twitter, and I tweet a lot. But that's all I have for you. Do you have any other questions?
Apparently not. Karen,
Well, actually, I do, and this is kind of a silly question.
No.
So I'm actually very new to like IT. I've always loved computers.
Mm-hmm.
I was just kind of trying to expose myself and just learn a little more, or just connect with people to try and get into the field. So that's just kind of, yeah.
So it's a comment, not a question?
Yeah, pretty much. I'm sorry. I'm new to all these things, and I'm just trying to learn what I can.
So this is my favorite way to learn about stuff. So Microsoft offers these free Azure accounts. They're free for a year. And you can start with this $200 Azure credit to go do things that aren't included in the free services.
Really?
But yeah. And so you can get 750 hours, that's a month, every month of an Azure virtual machine with Linux, with Windows, with you can get for 12 months a very small Azure SQL database, 5 gigabytes of storage, Azure Cosmos DB and these levels are really non-production levels, but that's what I love about them because they're free for a whole year. They're
Wow.
serverless computing things, and like this is the best kept secret about Azure. Like there's a lot more than what was just on there, like all kinds of technologies. There's some Kubernetes, there's serverless computing, there's data catalog, there's just all this stuff that's free. And then to add on to that, Microsoft Learning offers a whole bunch of free videos and courses and not formal exam preps, but a learning path for taking certification exams.
Right,
Wow.
guys, I actually just dropped that in the chat. It's specific to kind of what you're talking about, with being new to IT and probably then of course the cloud. So the link that I put in there is, it's literally the fundamentals of Azure that start with the basics of cloud computing,
Yeah.
not even into the specifics. But if you go to aka.ms/learn, or even if you go there and then click on like home or something like that, there is tons of free content from Microsoft, videos, labs. Like it'll even pop open like this side lab with this miniature Azure portal that you can work in to go through the lab. And so it's pretty awesome. I mean, even internal folks to Microsoft like me will go through these learning paths to brush up for a cert or a renewal cert, because things change so quickly too.
Yeah.
So, right.
And these free services, some of these are really expensive. So not to pick on Azure Cosmos DB, and by the way, I love Azure Cosmos DB, but because it's designed for scale and massive global reach with very tiny response times, it's expensive to use for me. But you get like a database with 400 request units, which is just a made up unit of measure for how they bill for compute and storage and database. But you can get, I mean, this is free to anyone. And I think there's a limitation on this. You can't use a free email account like Hotmail or Gmail or something, but I can't remember. This is the best kept secret of Azure.
What I was gonna say, so this is on Microsoft Azure because I can't access the chat,
Oh, okay.
unfortunately.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there's no chat.
I would have thought that it would still posted mine. Interesting.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
are you
so
the
we don't get
the
the chat up.
admin? Yeah, that
So
might be
here's
why.
where you need to go, right here, azure.microsoft.com. I mean, you could skip this en-us and free/free. So azure.microsoft.com/free will get you to this.
Right. Or aka dot, and then for the
Oh, yeah.
learning, aka.ms. So there's a lot of things. aka.ms.
Learn or learning?
Learn.
Learning.
MS/ and you said it was learn?
Learn. Yeah, it's not learning.
Yeah.
I always get that mixed up too, Karen. So I tested it.
Oh, okay, I got it. Thank you. Wow.
And this isn't just for new people to IT because, like he said, I use this all the time because it's free.
And the one like I would suggest for you that is that Ian? Yeah.
Yes. Sir.
So Ian, that like if you search, they might have these things in a different order than her homepage because I think they kind of tailor it. So, but what you want to look for is a learning path and Azure fundamentals, because the path will like, it'll group certain courses together and put them in an order that makes sense for that path.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's just so many of them. Yeah.
Hey, this is Laura. I'm actually working through the Azure Fundamentals learning path. And it's really good. I'm starting with that. I did take a class from DePaul in Chicago that's Azure Fundamentals. I took it last fall. And it's very close to the free Microsoft Azure fundamentals. But in that class, we created an Azure VM, a virtual machine, and did some other things in Azure, and I did that all with my free account. And after we created these things, we went in and cleaned up the work we did so that we wouldn't get charged. But in this learning path, if you go through and you just go through in order, it does have you do some exercises in Azure, and it creates a sandbox for you.
Yeah.
And it's real easy. You just click on a button and it just comes up in your sandbox that it created just for you, and you can easily follow the instructions. It's really nice.
Yeah. This is so different than what it was even 5 years ago. Like, you used to have to pay for all this stuff through a third-party service, pretty much,
Right.
or have a corporate sponsored unlimited Azure credits. So the reason I pointed out some of the expensive things that are free is that I do get a very nice benefit as part of being an MVP, a Microsoft MVP around Azure, because they give me lots of credits so that I can go learn these things and demo them. And it's easy to blow through an entire year's worth of credits just because you set up some massive 50 node cluster data warehouse, 60 node cluster data warehouse. And not only have you blown through all your credits, if you had it backed up with a credit card, you might have a giant bill. So that's why I like using an always free subscription with the more expensive things to save myself that.
I could definitely see how you would like that. Yeah, I'm really like what I'm seeing too. Like
Yeah.
oh.
Yeah, best kept secret in Azure. Go back to the screen.
Cool. Any other questions for Karen?
That was a great question.
Yeah.
Thank you for your answer. That really helped. Thank you so
Now
much.
you should go find a team on the Space Apps Challenge and learn with a team. Like, it's very common to do it that way too.
Really? So I was always under the impression that to do these hackathons, to do these things, you had to have like formal training. Like that's what a lot of people were telling me for certain things. And
Yeah, well, there are hackathons that are that way, like especially ones that have a big monetary prize. Like, this is mostly to introduce people. So the NASA Datanauts program right now is on hiatus because NASA is overwhelmed with getting to the moon and getting to Mars again. But it was a program created that spun out of this Space Apps Challenge to create a learning environment for 50 people every 6 months to go through and get informal training from mentors like me on how to work with open data. But we also had sessions like from actual rocket surgeons or rocket scientists on how space mechanics work or how the physics of data transfer works. It was really cool. Got to work with NASA data scientists, and every 6 months it was open to anyone in the world to come in and learn technology specifically around working with open data, which is really common. So it's very data focused. But like I said, right now that Datanaut program is kind of in hibernation because NASA got pulled in all these other directions. I hope it comes back, but even if it doesn't, that culture of making the Space Apps Challenge very inclusive, like I said, not even all the challenges have to do with code. There's an art one. You can do art based on open data and participate. But one of the things the virtual challenge does is it can help match you up with other teams. If you're just a single person and you can basically say, hey, I'm new, but I'm willing to help. And very few people actually write code in these challenges. Also, the biggest secret in hackathons is it's much more important that you come up with a great pitch and a great idea and a great concept around a solution in 3 days than it is to produce working code. If I weren't a judge, I'd be participating.
All right. Cool. Yeah, and again, and Ian, you know, I think feel free to reach out to us at Chicago Data Professionals at Gmail. You know, if you have any questions too. So, I think that's the whole point of the user group, is for us to be able to interact. And hopefully one of these days when we get to meet in person, the networking aspect of it is really what's key, right? Getting to talk shop a little bit around some pizza before and after a speaker, and trade information and stuff like that is key. And that's what we're planning on doing as soon as we can.
I hope to be back then sometime
Yeah.
too. My snark comes across better in person too.
All right. Well, thanks again, Karen, for taking time out of your busy schedule at the end of the day to speak with us. It was really cool to see some of those tools in action and to see you talk about it, because I think that's what a lot of people don't always think about, is all those other things that you and Tom have put on some of those slides, is things like backups and these DBCCs and different things that not everybody really thinks about. Double checking your data, because this isn't always a full backup. It's a backpack extraction, and who knows, so it's always good to double, triple, quadruple check if you can.
Yeah. So. I once went through a whole migration that took 3 days, only to find out that the DBA had given us the wrong backup. And we had to start again. But we found it because we did those brute force tests just of counting rows, which totally doesn't prove anything, but you start noticing things. So yeah. Okay.
Well, all right, I'm going to stop the recording. So, yep. Thanks again. And thanks everybody for